Welcome to Ask the Educator, a podcast brought to you by Healthmark Industries. Are you a sterile processing technician or manager? Maybe you work in infection prevention or biomedical engineering. Whether you're a frontline tech, endoscopy tech, OR nurse, or surgical services administrator, you undoubtedly have influence in medical device processing at your facility. In each episode, we speak with experts from the Healthmark Clinical Affairs team, industry leaders, or special guests from the trenches to answer your questions and bring you relevant industry information, equipping you for excellence in medical device processing. My name is Kevin Anderson, and I will be your host. Now let's get started.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Ask the Educator podcast. With me as always, my co-host, Adam Okada. Thanks, Adam, for joining me. And we're going to kind of circle back kind of to the beginning of this podcast. We started back in, 2020, I think now. So it's been a few years, but I think it was the third and fourth episodes, we talked about arthroscopic shavers. And so it's been a few years, like I said, and I kind of just wanted to circle back to this topic because now that we've both, and our entire team, to be honest, has been out in the field quite a bit since the end of the pandemic, we've been able to kind of go in and see what people are doing with their shavers and kind of resurface this topic and kind of see what the current state looks like. So, Adam, I don't know if you've been out in the hospitals as much as I have or have been looking at the shavers like I have, but just in short, like, what are you seeing when you go into the facilities and inspect the inside of shavers?
I mean, it's a very similar situation to what we saw early. I mean, the reason we did it, I think in May of 2020 was when you guys recorded those first two podcasts about shavers. We saw that there were a lot of issues with shavers. And I remember in my facilities as well, we had an outbreak having to do with shavers. I mean, it was early on in my career, but we did have an outbreak having to do with the shavers. And anytime I go into a facility, it's usually one of the first things I ask. Do you guys do arthroscopic shavers? If so, do you have specialty brushes that can clean those arthroscopic shavers? And the answer is almost always no. And then when I go in with a scope or borescope or whatever, I'm seeing dirty stuff. I'm seeing, just leftover residues, things like that, that unfortunately the brushes that we have, channel brushes, the block style, toothbrush style brushes, those brushes can't clean shavers effectively. And a lot of people they just wipe down the outside. They put a brush down that little port, the suction port, and they just sort of hope that that's good enough. But we know that that's not happening. We know that that's not getting proper clean. I don't know if you're seeing that same stuff out there.
I've actually been trying to collect some data on this because I think it's a really important topic. I'm glad that you mentioned, sort of glad. In a lot of ways, I'm not glad, but just the fact that you guys had an outbreak, it's one of those things that I think people kind of forget that these devices do carry risk with them. I know that there was the documented cases in Texas back in 2009, which is what AORN kind of cites as their rationale for recommending borescope inspection, which is great. However, you don't always hear of these infections, especially those of us who work in sterile processing. So it's one of those things where I'm glad that you knew about it, only because unfortunately that message doesn't always get back to sterile processing where all the cleaning takes place. That being said, I've done a lot of visits now. I probably it's somewhere in the 20s, like 22, 23 shavers that I've inspected over the past couple of years, and every single one of them had visible debris in them. And now one of the key takeaways there is, in my opinion, is that all of these shavers were dirty, and yet some of those facilities had borescopes and some of them did not have borescopes. So even the facilities that had the proper inspection equipment, unfortunately, we're not always producing a clean shaver. Now, obviously, it's a smaller sample size. When you go in, you just check, a spot check a shaver or two or what have you. Whereas, there's a possibility that they've gotten some clean, otherwise. But generally speaking, we're seeing every single shaver is dirty, which is not a very good percentage, unfortunately. And the fact that these folks some of them are investing in the proper inspection equipment, it further illustrates the point that you just brought up about the proper brushes. So it's like a three-pronged approach, I believe, is one is the training and following the IFU, two is having the proper inspection equipment, and three is having the proper brushes. And so there's like a three-pronged approach to getting these things clean. And hopefully people are starting to understand that. At least I'm trying to help them understand that as I go around and visit these places. Hopefully they're better off than when I got there. But that is the idea, is not to just, buy the right brushes or buy the inspection equipment, is actually making those things operationalized and making them happen every single time. It's a totally different story, as you probably are well aware as a former educator in a department. It can be very difficult at times to get everybody on the same page and to get them doing the right thing every single time, especially with shavers. I mean, we're talking, external brushes. We're talking probably 2 or 3 internal brushes just for one device, right?
Yeah, and
Yeah, so it's a lot more complicated than people realize, I think.
it is. And, I think that's the biggest issue, because I was going to ask you, like, what do you think we could do going forward to fix this? But I think in sterile processing, there's a real lack of understanding about what a shaver is and what it's used for. I think when people hear shaver, and I'll be honest, when I first started and I heard the term shaver, I assumed it was shaving hair off of the surgical site. That's what I assumed the shaver was for. That's not what arthroscopic shavers are doing. They're in there shaving bone. They're in there getting really gritty and nasty stuff inside of them. So when you're at the sink and cleaning these, it's one of those things, just like flexible scopes. I think the message has been put out about flexible scopes. Hey, we need to take time to do these. We're still seeing infections. We're still seeing problems with flexible scopes. But I think in general, the understanding is there that these are complex devices and they need to be looked at. I don't see that with shavers. I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding of what it does and then how difficult they can be to clean, to the point where IFUs, even the manufacturers, are acknowledging, because there's been so many mod reports. The FDA mod database has a lot of issues with shavers. So now the manufacturers are saying we need to, use some type of optical inspection inside. And how else do you do that but with a borescope? And I think that's a great justification. If anybody out there needs a borescope, some of these IFUs actually specify look inside of the shaver to make sure it's clean.
Yeah, that's a great point. Actually, multiple great points, Adam. So one of the things that you touched on was the IFU. Now, one thing that I find typically with IFUs, one is, you're correct. Most of the main arthroscopic shaver manufacturers have included borescope inspection now, with the exception of one that I found that does not. And that's where the recommendations from AORN and Amy come into play. And hopefully you adopt that practice regardless, because it's that important. Circling back to the IFU, many people do not know how to access the IFUs, or are unaware completely of, the fact that there's a lot of information in the IFUs specific to cleaning and inspection. It's not just all about sterilization. And that's where, we find sometimes people don't even know how to access the IFU, or they haven't accessed an IFU since their orientation, and so that's a really important piece of the puzzle. Another one is, if you are in the IFUs, you'll notice that some manufacturers, they recommend that borescope inspection take place in decontam, which makes a lot of sense. But a lot of times when people purchase borescopes, they put them in the assembly area, which is also fine and makes sense, but realize that, some IFUs are recommending this step take place in decontam, and some IFUs, I believe, are also recommending this step take place in the assembly area. Both make sense. There's a quality check that can be done, before you assemble for sterilization, and that's good. But even better would be to check it before it gets to that side, and be able to see your work and check whether or not your brushing practice is actually effective, right? And before it gets into the hands of, somebody on the clean side with no PPE on and all of that. So there's a lot of things that go into it, I believe. And I think another one that that you touched on is understanding what a shaver does. I think that's a great point, because these devices have been around for so long, and even I'm kind of guilty of this, because coming from the OR, I just kind of, that's what immediately comes to mind when I hear shaver, because we're actually not supposed to shave hair in the operating room. So I think of arthroscopic shavers, whereas other people may not, and they do. They hook in a disposable piece, and they're either grinding or chopping or whatever, and it's bone, it's soft tissue, and a lot of times we see what looks like, meniscus or synovium, soft tissue still stuck in that shaver. So a lot of great points there. Inspection with a borescope can be pretty challenging. So, is that something that, technically, have you ever been in sort of charge of training people how to use the borescope on an arthroscopic shaver, or is that something you never really had to do?
Was part of our training. I mean, I think we did borescope inspection on shavers for sure, flexible scopes. I'm trying to think of the things because we had a policy when we instituted it. So kind of going back to your point about the clean side versus the dirty side, whenever somebody says, well, where should I put my borescope? I always recommend they go on the dirty side, because again, you want to be able to see those things as soon as possible. If it's dirty and it goes to the clean side and you inspect it and see that it's dirty, that's better than letting it go to the OR, right?
Yeah.
But it's still not the ideal scenario. You want to be able to catch it in decontam, clean it immediately, and then it's safe to handle on the other side. So we had a policy based around our borescope. Our borescope, unfortunately, was only for the clean side. It was a manufacturer that was their instructions. It was a clean side inspection tool. And we did it on the clean side, and we had a policy about certain instrumentation or devices that we had to use the borescope on, and shavers were one of those. And we did have inspection points based on the shave. And actually, it was based on our own Sharon Rojo here at HealthMart came into our facility and did some education on it. And then staff was very concerned about the shavers, and they didn't have the right brushes, and they didn't have inspection tools. And so we fixed those things. We wrote it into the policy that shavers should be inspected. And we did see an increase in things going out for repair. That's always the result of borescope inspection, is all of a sudden our repair costs jump. But it's a good thing. You're catching the things that could cause problems for patients. And I kind of want to go back to something we talked about earlier with the infections and sterile processing not knowing. I actually have never been in a facility where the sterile processing manager or staff had ever heard that they had an infection. Apparently, all the hospitals in the United States have never had an infection, which we know is not true, because the CDC said between 2015 and 2021, there was a 3% increase in the number of surgical site infections. So I think what's happening is that IP is aware of these things, and there may be like legal issues, like that they want to settle out of court. They have non-disclosure agreements, but that information doesn't get back to sterile processing, I think, a lot of the time. So
Right.
This is a major issue. I mean, the reason we're bringing it up again is because we haven't done one in 3 years or 4 years almost on shavers. And this continues to be a problem in the industry, to the point where, like you said, I think it's like 100% of the facilities that we look at, we find some issue when we look inside the shavers. And that's just an insane number.
It can be a little bit frustrating sometimes, because we go, even like I mentioned, the facilities we go in that have the borescope or the tools in place to actually, inspect their work and then, course correct because of that. And yet we're still seeing the dirty shaver. So like, we need to identify gaps in the training, find out, are we doing it correctly? Are we training correctly? Are we doing it thoroughly? Are we doing any audits on our own shavers? Take them off the shelf, check and see. And then if they're dirty, go back to the technician and, have them demonstrate their practice and try to get to the cause of this problem, not in a, punitive way or whatever, but in a way that's you're actually coaching somebody on how to get where they need to be with such an important device. And to your point, so many of us don't have that connection taking place with the surgical site infections. And I think sometimes that root cause analysis with SSIs only happens if there's a huge spike or uptick. And then they'll go to the OR first. They might talk to anesthesia and all of them. And for some reason, sterile processing still gets left out of the equation. That's really unfortunate because they're such an integral part, in fighting surgical infections. So lots to kind of think about as we kind of revisit this old topic that is so challenging. But I think, I'll give it over to you to kind of, maybe sum up some final thoughts, if you will, to try and, help steer people in the right direction as it pertains to the correct processing of shaver handpieces.
My advice to people that are in charge of sterile processing or in charge of a training program that has to do with shavers, or even if you're just a technician that's concerned about the level of cleaning that's happening in your department with regards to shavers, I think my advice would be, if you're in charge of those areas, make sure you're connected to IP. First of all, make sure you're at the meetings for purchasing new devices so that you know what devices are coming in. You can review those IFUs and then connect to the staff and make sure that they know, hey, this new device is coming in. Here's how we clean it. And then also, I think it's really important to have the right tools. So again, a borescope is required in certain IFUs for shavers, or it has strange language like inspect the internal components of the shaver, which is the same thing as saying you need a borescope. And so having the tools, the right brushes, the right borescope, or some type of device that can look inside. And then the training component, make sure that staff understands the usage for it. It's not just enough to tell them, hey, this device is complex. Here's all the places you need to clean. They really need to understand why. And like you said, there's bone, there's tissue, there's a lot of things that are coming into those shavers that we're not used to seeing unless it's like an acetabular reamer or something like that. So I think if they understand the importance of it, I think if they understand the usage of it, that really connects in. If we have the right tools, we have the right information, sterile processing techs usually do the right thing. I don't think, unless you're a sociopath, you're not just going to skip a lot of steps in the process. So I think it's important, again, that having the tools, having that training, and then connecting the why behind it.
That's perfectly said. And I would just add basically one thing for those out there that lead the departments, whether you're an educator or manager or supervisor, something to be mindful of is the size of your department and the volume of arthroscopy cases you do. And I say that because in order to properly equip a department for doing these shavers correctly is, yes, investing in the borescope, and yes, getting the brushes, the correct brushes for the job. But it's also the amount. The training and having the equipment is all extremely important and foundational. But I've seen departments that are rather large go and invest in, say, one borescope, and then they put it in the corner of the department somewhere. And they say, this is going to be our inspection station. And they teach everybody the right thing. And, lo and behold, they end up having the same problem. And I think part of that is because they simply don't have this equipment in proximity. It's out of sight, out of mind. They forget about it, or maybe someone else is using it when you need it. And then all of a sudden that step gets skipped, and it's not on purpose, but it's just because there's not enough of what you need. And that's just like, I fall back on it a lot, but I used to work in the operating room. If we didn't have a basic cautery machine in every single OR, the surgeon would lose their mind. Like, you would have to go to some storage area and to find one, or poach from another OR. That would be unheard of. And this is the kind of thing that in our SPD today, it should be common equipment. It should be at each station, just like an insulation tester should be at each station. If you don't have it there, you're just increasing the chances that the step's not going to get done. So anyway, those are my 2 cents on, kind of prepping your department for success with shavers. I know we went a little bit over time, but this is one of those things that clearly it's a very important topic, and we're still not where we need to be as an industry when it comes to cleaning shavers. So Adam, thanks for bringing up the idea. I'm glad that we touched on it again. And hopefully, if you guys have any questions, feel free to reach out. We do have an Ask the Educator at HMark email address. So we're always open to questions and would love to hear from you. But hopefully this is a good refresher for you. And please feel free to reach out to your local HealthMark representative if you are in need of any brushes or borescope inspection devices. We are happy to do that for you. It is such an important piece of the puzzle when it comes to doing shavers correctly. So with that, we'll see you on the next episode. And as always, Adam, thank you for your help.
All opinions expressed on this show are those of the presenters. Before using any medical device, it is important to review the device manufacturer's instructions for use.